going to read some passages that explain how childhood trauma can lead to really terrible things happening in society. TikTok is funny about the small mustache man. Like, if you say his name, it hides the video. So I'm not going to say his name. And I'm also not going to say the name of the big event that he is associated with, but hopefully everybody knows what I'm talking about now. The more insight I gained into the dynamics of perversion through my analytic work, the more I questioned the view advanced repeatedly since the end of the war, that a handful of perverted people were responsible for the event that starts with an H. The mass M-word showed not a trace of specific symptoms of perversion, such as isolation, loneliness, shame, and despair. They were not isolated, but belonged to a supportive group. They were not ashamed, but proud. And they were not despairing, but either euphoric or apathetic. The other explanation was that these were people who worshipped authority and were accustomed to obey. That one is not wrong, but neither is it adequate to explain the phenomenon like the H event. If by obeying we mean the carrying out of commands that we consciously regard as being forced upon us, people with any sensitivity cannot be turned into mass unalivers overnight. But the men and women who carried out the final solution did not let their feelings stand in the way, for the simple reason that they had been raised from infancy to not have any feelings of their own, but to experience their parents' wishes as their own. These were the people who, as children, had been proud of being tough and not crying, of carrying out all of their duties gladly, and of not being afraid, that is, not having any inner life at all. I'm skipping forward, but a lack of feelings as an ideal manifested itself in many modern writers until approximately 1975, as well as the geometric trend in painting. In a 1973 book, we read, "Dietger can't cry. He was terribly upset by his grandma's death. He loved his grandma deeply. On the way back from the burial service, he said, 'I'm trying to decide if I should squeeze out a few tears.' 'Squeeze out,' he said." Dietger says, "I don't need to have dreams." Dietger is proud of the fact that he doesn't dream. He says, "I never dream. I sleep soundly." Jetta says Dietger is denying his unconscious perceptions and feelings as well as his dreams. Dietger is a post-war child. And what feelings did Dietger's parents have? Little is known about that, for their generation was allowed to express its true feelings even less than the present one. I'm skipping ahead a bit, but once feelings have been eliminated, the submissive person functions perfectly and reliably, even if he knows no one is going to check up on him. This perfect adaptation to society's norms, in other words, what is called healthy normality, carries with it the danger that such a person can be used for practically any purpose. It is not a loss of autonomy that occurs here because this autonomy never existed, but a switching of values, which in themselves are of no importance anyway for the person in question, as his whole value system is dominated by the principle of obedience. He has never gone beyond the stage of idealizing his parents with their demands for unquestioning obedience. This idealization can easily be transferred to a person or an ideology. Since authoritarian parents are always right, there is no need for their children to rack their brains in each case to determine whether what is demanded of them is right or not, and how is this to be judged. Where are the standards supposed to come from if someone has always been told what is right and what is wrong, and if he never had an opportunity to become familiar with his own feelings, and if, beyond that, attempts at criticism were unacceptable to the parents and thus were too threatening for the child? If an adult has not developed a mind of his own, then he will find himself at the mercy of authorities, for better or worse, just as an infant finds himself at the mercy of its parents. Saying no to those more powerful will always seem too threatening to him. Witnesses of sudden political upheavals report again and again with what astonishing facility many people are able to adapt to a new situation. Overnight, they can advocate views totally different from those they held the day before, without noticing the contradiction. With the change in the power structure, yesterday has completely disappeared for them. And yet, even if this observation should apply to many, perhaps even to most people, it is not true for everyone. There have always been individuals who refuse to be reprogrammed quickly, if ever. We could use our psychoanalytic knowledge to address the question of what causes this important, even crucial difference. With its aid, we could attempt to discover why some people are so extraordinarily susceptible to the dictates of leaders and groups and why others remain immune to these influences. We admire people who oppose the regime in a totalitarian country and think they have courage or a strong moral sense or have maintained true to their principles or the like. We may also smile at their naivete, thinking, don't they realize that their words are of no use at all against the oppressive power? Yet it is possible that both those who admire and those who scorn these protesters are missing the real point. Individuals who refuse to adapt to a totalitarian regime are not doing so out of a sense of duty or because of naivete, but because they cannot help but be true to themselves. The longer I wrestle with these questions, the more I am inclined to see courage, integrity, and a capacity for love not as virtues, not as moral categories, but as a consequence of a benign fate. Morality and performance of duty are artificial measures that become necessary when something essential is lacking. The more successfully a person has denied access to his or her feelings in childhood, the larger the arsenal of intellectual weapons and the supply of moral prostheses has to be, because morality and a sense of duty are not sources of strength or fruitful soil for genuine affection. Blood does not flow in artificial limbs. They are for sale and can serve many masters. What was considered good yesterday can, depending on the decree of government or party, be considered evil and corrupt today, and vice versa. But those who have spontaneous feelings can only be themselves. They have no choice if they want to remain true to themselves. Rejection, ostracism, loss of love, and name-calling will not fail to affect them. They will suffer as a result and will dread them. Once they have found their authentic self, they will not want to lose it. And when they sense that something is being demanded of them to which their whole being says no, they cannot do it. They simply cannot. This is the case with people who had the good fortune of being sure of their parents' love even if they had to disappoint certain parental expectations, or with people who, although they did not have this good fortune to begin with, learned later, for example in analysis, to risk the loss of love in order to regain their lost self. They will not be willing to relinquish it again for any price in the world. Since no one can live entirely without feelings, such a person will join groups that sanction or even encourage the forbidden feelings, which he or she will finally be allowed to live out within a collective framework. Every ideology offers its adherents the opportunity to discharge their pent-up affect collectively while retaining the idealized primary object, which is transferred to new leader figures or to the group in order to make up for its lack of satisfying symbiosis with the mother. Idealization of narcissistically cathected group guarantees collective grandiosity. Since every ideology provides a scapegoat outside of the confines of its own splendid group, the weak and scorned child who is part of the total self but has been split off and never acknowledged can now be openly scorned and assailed in this scapegoat. In reference to Himmler's speech of weakness, which is to be exterminated and cauterized, demonstrates very clearly the role assigned to Jewish people by some suffering from grandiosity who attempts to split off from unwell elements of his own psyche. In the same way that analytic familiarity with the mechanisms of splitting off and projection can help us to understand the phenomenon of the H event, a knowledge of the history of the Third Reich helps us to see the consequences of poisonous pedagogy more clearly. Against the backdrop of rejection of childishness instilled by our training, it becomes easier to understand why men and women had little difficulty leading 1 million children, who they regarded as the bearers of the feared portions of their own psyche, into gas chambers. One can even imagine that by shouting at them, beating them, or photographing them, they were finally able to release the hatred going back to their early childhood. From the start, it had been the aim of their upbringing to stifle their childish, playful, and life-affirming side. The cruelty inflicted on them, the psychic unaliving of the child they once were, had to be passed on in the same way. Each time they sent another Jewish child into the ovens, they were in essence unaliving the child within themselves.